You feel overwhelmed by daily pressures that seem to multiply endlessly, and every setback shakes your confidence to the core. The stress follows you everywhere, affecting your sleep, your relationships, and your ability to think clearly, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar or greater burdens. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history, bearing the weight of millions of lives through plagues, wars, and impossible decisions that could reshape the world. The Stoic principles I developed will give you an unshakable fortress of calm that no external pressure can penetrate. Using the same philosophy that sustained me through the darkest times an emperor could face, the same wisdom that guided me through governing an empire during one of history's most challenging periods can guide you through any modern challenge, because true strength has always come from mastering yourself rather than trying to control circumstances. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless Stoic wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see how far across the world the need for inner strength and philosophical leadership has spread. I was never meant to be emperor. At 19, I was a quiet student of philosophy, content to spend my days studying rhetoric and contemplating the nature of virtue. I had watched my adoptive father, Antoninus, pious rule with wisdom and compassion, but I harbored no ambitions for the purple myself. My passion lay in the teachings of Epictetus and the ancient Stoics, who spoke of inner freedom and the discipline of desire. Then fate intervened, as it always does, without asking our permission or consulting our plans. When Antoninus Pius lay dying, he named me his successor. In a single moment, the weight of 60 million souls fell upon my shoulders. I remember standing in that chamber, watching the life fade from the only father I had truly known, and feeling the crushing realization that I would never again be simply Marcus. From that moment forward, I would be Caesar Augustus, ruler of the known world. The contradiction nearly broke me. How could someone who believed that external things held no real value suddenly find himself responsible for the ultimate external thing, an entire empire? How could a student of philosophy, who sought to detach himself from worldly concerns, now be forced to immerse himself completely in the most worldly concerns imaginable? Every decision I made would affect millions of lives. Every moment of weakness or poor judgment could ripple across continents. But it was precisely in this contradiction that I discovered the true power of philosophy. The Stoic teachings I had studied in peaceful academies suddenly became urgent, practical tools for survival. When advisors pressured me to make decisions based on political expedience rather than moral principle, I learned to ask myself, what would virtue demand in this situation? When the burden of responsibility threatened to overwhelm me, I practiced the discipline of focusing only on what lay within my control, my own thoughts, decisions, and responses. I realized that ruling an empire and ruling oneself required identical skills. Both demanded the ability to see clearly through the fog of emotion and circumstance. Both required unwavering commitment to principle even when convenience beckoned toward compromise. Both necessitated the strength to make difficult decisions, knowing that criticism would follow from those who didn't understand. The full picture, the palace that became my home, was filled with flatterers and manipulators, people who saw my position as a means to advance their own interests. Yet philosophy taught me to distinguish between their words and their character, to respond to their humanity rather than react to their schemes. I learned that true power came not from the ability to punish or reward others, but from the capacity to remain unchanged by their attempts to influence me. Every morning, before the senators and generals arrived with their urgent matters of state, I would spend time in reflection, reminding myself of what I truly controlled and what I did not. I would contemplate the temporary nature of all things, my reign, my life, even the empire itself, This practice didn't diminish my sense of responsibility, it clarified it. When you truly understand that your time is limited and your control is constrained, you become fiercely focused on using both wisely. The young philosopher who feared the corruption of power discovered that power itself was neither good nor evil, was simply a tool like a sword or a plough. Its moral value depended entirely on how it was wielded and for what purpose. I learned to see my position not as a privilege to be enjoyed, but as a duty to be discharged with honor. The most important discovery of my reign was not found in any conquered territory or diplomatic treaty. It was the realization that every human being possesses an impregnable fortress within their own mind. I call this the inner citadel, a sanctuary that no external force can breach unless you yourself open the gates. When I first took the throne, I was vulnerable to every slight, every criticism, every setback that came my way. A senator's disapproving glance could ruin my morning. A report of unrest in a distant province could steal my sleep for weeks. I was like a city with broken walls, defenseless against any attack from the outside world. But gradually, through daily practice and philosophical discipline, I learned to construct unbreachable defenses around my peace of mind. The foundation of this inner citadel is the fundamental Stoic principle, the clear distinction between what is up to you and what is not up to you. This sounds simple, almost trivial, until you begin to apply it rigorously to every aspect of your life. You quickly discover that the vast majority of things that disturb your tranquility fall into the category of not up to you. The weather is not up to you. Other people's opinions are not up to you. The past is not up to you. The future, despite all your planning, is ultimately not up to you. Even your own body, with its inevitable aging and ultimate death, is largely not up to you. When you truly internalize this truth, you stop wasting energy trying to control the uncontrollable and focus all your power on the narrow but crucial domain where you actually have influence. What is up to you? Your judgments, your decisions, your responses, your values, and your character. This may seem like a small realm compared to the vast empire I governed, but I discovered it contained infinite space for growth and infinite potential for peace. Within this domain, you are truly sovereign. No one can force you to judge a situation as catastrophic rather than challenging. No one can compel you to respond with anger rather than wisdom. No one can make you abandon your principles unless you choose to do so. I developed a daily practice that I followed religiously. Whether I was in the comfort of my palace or in a military tent on the frontier, each morning, before the day's responsibilities could intrude, I would spend time fortifying my inner citadel. I would remind myself of what I could and could not control. I would mentally rehearse how to respond virtuously to likely challenges. I would contemplate the temporary nature of all external things and recommit myself to the permanent value of character throughout the day. Whenever I felt my peace threatened by external circumstances, I would retreat momentarily to this inner sanctuary. A breath, a brief reflection, a quick return to philosophical principles. These became my tools for maintaining equilibrium in chaos. I learned that this retreat was not escape from responsibility, but preparation for it. The calmer and more centered I remained, the better I could serve those who depended on my leadership. The inner citadel is not built in a day. Like any fortress, it requires constant maintenance and improvement. Each time you successfully apply philosophical principles to real-world challenges, you strengthen its walls. Each time you choose virtue over convenience, you deepen its foundations. Each time you maintain your values under pressure, you raise its towers higher. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that this fortress exists not to isolate you from the world but to enable you to engage with it more effectively. When you know that your essential peace cannot be disturbed, you become fearless in pursuing what is right. When you understand that your worth comes from your character rather than external circumstances, you become free to take necessary risks and make difficult decisions. The inner citadel doesn't make you passive, it makes you unstoppable. No amount of philosophical preparation could have readied me for the Antonine Plague. When the disease first appeared in our eastern provinces, brought back by troops returning from campaigns in Mesopotamia, I thought we were facing a typical outbreak that would pass with proper medical attention and administrative response. Was wrong. What followed was a catastrophe that would test every principle I had learned and every belief I held about leadership, duty, and the fragility of human life. The plague swept through the empire like fire through dry grain. Cities that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ghost towns within months. Trade routes that had connected our world collapsed as merchants and travelers died or fled. The very foundations of Roman civilizations seemed to crumble before my eyes. Conservative estimates suggest that 5 million people died during the 15 years this pestilence ravaged our lands. Some scholars believe the number was far higher, as Emperor I faced decisions that no human being should ever have to make. Should we quarantine entire cities, knowing that thousands of healthy people would be trapped with the diseased? Should we redirect grain shipments from hungry provinces to provide for plague refugees, knowing that others would starve? Should we continue military campaigns on the frontier while our heartland was dying? Every choice carried the weight of countless lives, and there were no perfect answers. It was during this crisis that I truly understood what philosophy was meant to accomplish. This was not an academic exercise in contemplating abstract principles. This was philosophy as a life or death tool for making impossible decisions while maintaining one's sanity and moral compass. When the traditional structures of society collapse, when the normal rules no longer apply, when every day brings fresh horror, that is, when you discover whether your philosophical convictions are genuine or merely intellectual ornaments. I learned to find strength in accepting what I could not control. I could not stop the plague itself, could not bring back the dead, could not undo the suffering that had already occurred, but I could control my response. I could ensure that our government continued to function when people needed it most. I could model calmness and rationality when others were consumed by panic. I could make each decision based on virtue rather than fear. There were moments when the burden felt unbearable. I remember receiving reports that entire legions had been decimated not by enemy action but by disease. I recall walking through the streets of Rome and seeing funeral pyres burning day and night because there weren't enough priests to perform proper burial rites for all the dead. The temptation to despair was constant and overwhelming, but I had learned from my Stoic teachers that despair is a luxury that leaders cannot afford. My personal grief, my philosophical doubts, my human terror at the scope of the catastrophe, these were all understandable emotions, but they could not be permitted to interfere with my duty to those who survived. I developed the discipline of feeling these emotions fully, acknowledging their validity, and then setting them aside to focus on the next decision that needed to be made. The plague taught me that leadership in crisis requires a peculiar combination of cold rationality and warm compassion. You must be able to analyze situations objectively without the distortion of wishful thinking or emotional bias. But you must also remember that every statistic represents a human being. Every policy decision affects real families. Every choice you make will either increase or decrease actual suffering in the world. I found that philosophy provided an unexpected source of practical guidance during these dark years. The Stoic emphasis on virtue helped me prioritize policies that served the common good over those that would have enhanced my political position. The practice of contemplating impermanence helped me maintain perspective when temporary setbacks threatened to overwhelm our response efforts. The discipline of focusing on what I could control prevented me from wasting energy on blame or regret. Perhaps most importantly, The crisis taught me that true leadership is not about having all the answers, it's about maintaining the courage to keep making decisions when all the options are terrible. It's about preserving hope when hope seems irrational. It's about serving others when you yourself are struggling to survive. The plague passed, as all things do, but the lessons it taught about the application of philosophical principles to extreme circumstances became central to everything I accomplished afterward. The greatest battles I ever fought were not against Germanic tribes or Parthian armies, but against my own tendency to see situations through the distorting lens of emotion, assumption, and past experience. I learned that perception, the way we interpret and frame events, determines our reality far more than the events themselves. Mastering this discipline became essential not only for my peace of mind, but for my effectiveness as a leader. When I was younger, before philosophy had trained my sight, I lived in a world of constant drama. A delayed message from a provincial governor became evidence of incompetence or disloyalty. A senator's absence from court suggested plotting or disrespect. A military setback indicated failure of my entire strategic approach. I was like a man seeing monsters in every shadow, exhausting myself, fighting threats that existed primarily in my own imagination. The turning point came when I began practicing what I called the discipline of perception, the systematic training of my mind to see situations as they actually were rather than as my fears, hopes, or prejudices suggested they might be. This required developing new mental habits that went against every instinct of human nature. First, I learned to separate facts from interpretations. When reports reached me that a particular tribe had crossed our border, that was a fact. My immediate assumption that this represented a coordinated invasion requiring massive military response, that was interpretation. When a senator spoke against one of my proposals in the forum, that was a fact. My feeling that this represented personal disrespect or political conspiracy, that was interpretation. By training myself to identify this distinction, I could respond to actual situations rather than react to my own mental elaborations. I developed the practice of examining every situation from multiple perspectives before making judgments. When facing what appeared to be a crisis, I would force myself to consider, how might this look to someone with different information? What alternative explanations could account for what I'm observing? What would I advise someone else if they came to me with this exact situation? This practice consistently revealed possibilities and solutions that my initial emotional reaction had obscured. One of the most powerful techniques I discovered was what I came to call the view from above. When caught in the intensity of immediate circumstances, I would mentally step back and imagine how this situation would appear from a broader perspective. How would this crisis look in a year? How significant would this setback seem in the context of my entire reign? How would a wise advisor from another era counsel me about this challenge? This elevated viewpoint almost always revealed that my initial perception had magnified problems and minimized my capacity to handle them. I also learned to question the stories I told myself about other people's motivations. When someone opposed my policies or criticized my decisions, my natural inclination was to assume malicious intent or personal animosity. But I trained myself to consider more charitable explanations. Perhaps they had information I lacked. Perhaps they were motivated by genuine concern for the empire's welfare. Perhaps they were struggling with pressures I couldn't see. This shift in perception transformed potential enemies into potential allies and reduced the emotional energy I wasted on resentment. The discipline of perception proved especially valuable when dealing with setbacks and failures. Instead of seeing these as evidence of my incompetence or as catastrophic threats to my reign, I learned to perceive them as information and opportunities. A failed military campaign revealed weaknesses in our strategy that could be corrected. A political defeat in the Senate indicated areas where I needed to build stronger consensus. A personal mistake highlighted aspects of my character that required further development, but perhaps the most profound application of this discipline was learning to perceive obstacles as training rather than punishment. Every difficult person who entered my life became an opportunity to practice patience and understanding. Every crisis that threatened the empire became a chance to demonstrate leadership and philosophical principles under pressure. Every personal loss became a lesson in acceptance and the temporary nature of all things. This transformation of perception required constant vigilance. The mind's tendency to create drama, to catastrophize, to assume the worst. These patterns reassert themselves whenever attention relaxes. I made the discipline of perception a daily practice, regularly examining my judgments and assumptions, consciously choosing interpretations that served wisdom rather than ego. The result was not just greater peace of mind, though that was certainly a welcome benefit. More importantly, this disciplined perception made me a more effective leader. When you see situations clearly, without the distortion of emotional reactivity, you make better decisions. When you understand people's true motivations, rather than projecting your own fears onto them, you can work with them more effectively. When you perceive obstacles as opportunities and setbacks as information, you become resilient and adaptable rather than brittle and defensive. In a world obsessed with wealth, fame, and pleasure, I discovered something that most people spend their entire lives searching for but never find: a compass that never fails, a guide that never misleads, a treasure that cannot be stolen. That compass is virtue, the only thing in this universe that is truly good in itself, regardless of circumstances or consequences. Early in my reign, I was surrounded by advisors who spoke constantly of political advantage, economic benefit, and strategic positioning. They measured every decision by its potential to increase the empire's power, enhance my popularity, or secure some material gain. While these considerations had their place, I gradually realized they were insufficient. Guides for a life worth living. External goods are unreliable. They come and go based on forces beyond our control. But virtue remains constant, available to every person in every circumstance. The Stoic philosophers taught me that there are 4 cardinal virtues that together constitute the complete foundation for human excellence: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. These became my daily companions, the standards against which I measured every choice and the qualities I sought to develop regardless of external pressures. Wisdom meant more than accumulating knowledge or making clever political calculations. True wisdom was the ability to see clearly through the complexity of situations, to understand what was truly important. It meant recognizing the difference between what merely appeared valuable and what actually was valuable. When faced with difficult decisions, I learned to ask not what will advance my interests, but what would wisdom recommend. This simple shift in question transformed my approach to governance and personal relationships. Justice extended far beyond legal decisions or policy making. It encompassed fairness, integrity, and genuine concern for the welfare of others. As emperor, I had the power to benefit my friends and punish my enemies. But justice demanded that I consider the needs of all citizens equally. I learned that true justice required sacrificing personal preferences for the common good and treating people based on their character and actions rather than their usefulness to me. Courage proved to be more complex than I had initially understood. Physical bravery in battle was certainly part of it, but far more challenging was the moral courage required to do what was right when it was unpopular, expensive, or personally costly. The courage to admit mistakes, to change course when evidence demanded it, to stand alone when necessary. This kind of courage was tested daily in the imperial court, where conformity and flattery were the norm. Temperance taught me that true strength lies in self-mastery rather than external dominance. As emperor, I could have indulged any appetite, pursued any pleasure, or satisfied any whim. But I discovered that every indulgence weakened my character, and every act of self-discipline strengthened it. Temperance wasn't about depriving myself of joy, but about finding joy in what was truly worthy of it. What made virtue so powerful as a guide was its consistency across all situations. Whether I was dealing with foreign diplomats or domestic rebels, making decisions about taxation or military strategy, confronting personal loss or celebrating public victory, virtue always pointed in the same direction. It demanded that I act with wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, regardless of the specific circumstances. I learned that virtue is unique among human pursuits because it cannot be diminished by external events. Wealth can be stolen, fame can fade, health can fail, but no one can take away your commitment to virtue unless you surrender it yourself. This realization was incredibly liberating. It meant that my fundamental worth as a human being was not dependent on the success or failure of my policies, the loyalty or betrayal of my associates, or the praise or criticism of my subjects. The pursuit of virtue also provided a solution to the problem of motivation that plagues many leaders. When your primary goal is external wealth, power, recognition, you become dependent on achieving those outcomes to feel successful. But when your primary goal is virtue, you can feel successful every day simply by acting virtuously, regardless of the results. This doesn't mean being indifferent to outcomes, but it means finding your deepest satisfaction in the process of living according to your highest principles. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that virtue is self-reinforcing. Each virtuous action makes the next one easier. Each compromise with vice makes the next compromise more likely. By consistently choosing virtue over convenience, courage over comfort, justice over advantage, I gradually became the kind of person for whom these choices felt natural rather than difficult. This commitment to virtue as the ultimate standard transformed not just my personal life but my entire approach to leadership. Instead of asking what will make me popular, I asked what will serve justice. Instead of wondering what will increase my power, I wondered what will demonstrate wisdom. This shift didn't always make leadership easier, but it made it infinitely more meaningful and sustainable. Nothing tests the practical value of philosophy quite like writing your deepest thoughts while Germanic war horns sound in the distance and the smell of smoke from burned villages drifts through your tent. For nearly 8 years, I lived on the northern frontier, leading campaigns against tribes that threatened our borders, sleeping in military camps, and making life-and-death decisions, while my philosophical convictions were tested by the brutal realities of warfare. It was during these campaigns that I wrote many of the reflections that would later be called my meditations. People often express surprise that some of history's most profound philosophical insights emerged not from peaceful academic settings, but from the chaos and violence of military camps. But I discovered that extreme circumstances don't diminish the relevance of philosophical principles, they reveal their true power. When I first arrived on the Danube frontier, I faced a strategic situation that seemed almost impossible. Multiple Germanic tribes had formed coalitions against us, crossing our borders in coordinated attacks that stretched our defenses beyond their limits. Traditional Roman military doctrine called for swift, decisive action to restore imperial prestige and secure our territories. But the reality on the ground was far more complex than any doctrine could address. I spent my first weeks studying not just military intelligence, but the deeper patterns that had led to this conflict. What I discovered was that our previous policies had often treated symptoms rather than causes. We had responded to border incursions with punishment, rather than understanding what drove these tribes to risk everything in attacks against the empire. I began to see that lasting peace would require more than military victory. It would require addressing the underlying pressures that forced proud peoples into desperate conflicts. This insight led me to develop a strategy that combined military strength with diplomatic engagement. While maintaining strong defensive positions, I also initiated negotiations with tribal leaders, seeking to understand their needs and concerns. Some of my generals were skeptical of this approach, preferring the clarity of total war to the complexity of nuanced diplomacy. But I had learned from philosophy that sustainable solutions usually require understanding all parties' perspectives, even those of your enemies. The physical demands of frontier life provided unexpected opportunities for philosophical practice. Sleeping on hard ground in a drafty tent taught me lessons about desire and contentment that no amount of reading could have conveyed. Eating simple military rations while worrying about supply lines helped me understand the difference between genuine needs and artificial wants. Leading men into situations where death was a daily possibility clarified the importance of living each day with integrity and purpose. I developed the habit of writing in my journal each evening, regardless of how exhausting the day had been or how urgent the next day's challenges appeared. These weren't formal philosophical treatises, but personal reflections on how to apply Stoic principles to the immediate realities I was facing. How do you maintain compassion when ordering actions that will result in human deaths? How do you balance the needs of your soldiers with the demands of strategy? How do you find meaning in activities that seem to contradict your deepest values about human dignity and peace? One of my most profound realizations came during a particularly difficult siege. We had surrounded a Germanic stronghold where warriors, women, and children had taken refuge. Standard military practice would have been to starve them out or storm the fortifications. But I kept thinking about the individual human beings trapped inside those walls. They weren't abstract enemies, they were people with families, hopes, and fears just like our own soldiers. I spent days walking the perimeter of our siege lines, thinking about the nature of conflict and the possibility of resolution that honored everyone's humanity. Eventually, I decided to offer generous terms for surrender, including safe passage and resettlement opportunities within the empire for those who chose peaceful coexistence. Many of my officers thought this was a sign of weakness, but I believed it was an expression of strength, the strength that comes from acting according to principle rather than convention. The strategy worked better than anyone had expected. Word of our approach spread throughout the region, and other tribal groups began seeking negotiated settlements rather than fighting to the death. We achieved more lasting peace through this combination of strength and mercy than we had ever accomplished through purely military means. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned on the frontier was that philosophy isn't a luxury for peaceful times, it's most essential. When circumstances are most challenging, when you're tired, stressed, facing difficult decisions under pressure, surrounded by people who may not share your values, that's exactly when you need philosophical principles to guide your actions. The comfort of abstract intellectual discussions pales compared to the solid support that well-internalized wisdom provides when everything around you is chaos. Those years on the frontier taught me that being a warrior and being a philosopher weren't contradictory roles, they were complementary ones. The warrior's courage and discipline served philosophical ideals, while philosophical wisdom guided the warrior's actions toward just and meaningful ends. This integration of contemplation and action, of principle and practice, became central to my understanding of what it means to live a complete human life. Every morning when I woke, whether in the imperial palace or a frontier tent, I would remind myself of a simple truth that most people spend their entire lives trying to forget. I am going to die. Not someday in the distant future, not when I'm old and ready, but potentially today. This practice, which the Stoics call memento mori, remember death, became one of the most transformative disciplines of my life. Most people recoil from thoughts of mortality, believing that dwelling on death will make them morbid or paralyzed by fear. I discovered exactly the opposite. Regular contemplation of death didn't diminish my appreciation for life. It intensified it beyond anything I had previously experienced. When you truly internalize that your time is limited and uncertain, every moment becomes precious. Every relationship becomes significant. Every choice becomes urgent. As emperor, I was surrounded by the illusion of permanence. The marble palaces, the elaborate ceremonies, the deference of millions, everything in my environment suggested that my reign would last forever, and that I was somehow exempt from the natural laws that govern all living things. This was perhaps the most dangerous delusion I could have embraced. The moment a leader begins to believe in his own permanence is the moment he stops making decisions with appropriate urgency and wisdom. I made it a practice to regularly visit the tombs of my predecessors, standing before the sarcophagi of men who had once held the same power I wielded, who had faced similar challenges and made similar decisions. I was reminded that all of them, regardless of their accomplishments or failures, had eventually surrendered their authority to death. Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius had been reduced to stone markers and fading memories. This wasn't a morbid exercise, but a clarifying one. It helped me understand that my reign was a temporary stewardship, not a permanent possession. That contemplation of death also transformed my relationship with loss. When I lost friends, advisors, or family members, the grief was real and profound, but it wasn't accompanied by the shocked disbelief that often makes loss unbearable. Because I had regularly imagined such losses, I was better prepared to accept them when they occurred. This didn't make the pain less real, but it made it more manageable and less likely to cloud my judgment or paralyze my ability to continue serving those who remained. Perhaps most importantly, memento mori became a tool for prioritizing what truly mattered. When facing difficult decisions about how to spend my time and energy, I would ask myself, if I knew I had only 1 year to live, would this be how I would choose to use it? This simple question cut through the noise of competing demands and social expectations to reveal what was genuinely important versus what was merely urgent or convenient. I discovered that the awareness of mortality made me more, not less, willing to take meaningful risks. When you understand that your time is limited, you become less concerned with preserving what you have and more focused on using it for worthy purposes. I found myself more willing to pursue justice even when it was politically costly, more inclined to speak truth even when it was unwelcome, more committed to virtue even when it was inconvenient. The practice also helped me develop what I came to think of as appropriate detachment from outcomes. When you remember that both you and everyone you're trying to influence will eventually die, you become less invested in controlling how others respond to your actions and more focused on ensuring that those actions align with your values. This detachment wasn't indifference. I cared deeply about the welfare of the empire and its people, but it was freedom from the anxious need for approval or the desperate fear of criticism. Memento mori taught me to view each day as both a gift and a responsibility. The gift aspect encouraged gratitude for whatever time I had been given, whatever relationships I could enjoy, whatever opportunities I could pursue. The responsibility aspect reminded me that this time was not unlimited and should not be wasted on trivial pursuits or petty concerns. But perhaps the most profound effect of this practice was how it transformed my understanding of legacy. When you regularly contemplate your own mortality, you begin to think seriously about what will remain after you're gone. This led me to focus less on monuments and more on principles, less on preserving my reputation and more on serving causes that would outlast my lifetime. The question became not how will I be remembered, but what will I contribute to the ongoing human conversation about how to live well? One of the most counterintuitive practices I developed was deliberately imagining the loss of everything I valued most. This wasn't pessimism or morbid thinking. It was a systematic method for building resilience and deepening appreciation that I called negative visualization. By regularly contemplating potential setbacks, losses, and reversals of fortune, I prepared my mind to handle whatever challenges actually materialized. Each morning, I would spend time imagining scenarios that might unfold during the day. What if the Germanic tribes launched a surprise attack? What if key advisors betrayed my trust? What if I received news of rebellion in distant provinces? What if illness struck members of my family? I would visualize these possibilities not to create anxiety, but to mentally rehearse how I would respond with wisdom and virtue regardless of what occurred. This practice emerged from a crucial insight about human psychology. We suffer more in anticipation of pain than we do when actually experiencing it. Most of our distress comes not from present circumstances, but from our fear of future circumstances, or our regret about past ones. By consciously imagining potential difficulties and rehearsing virtuous responses to them, I could reduce both the shock of unexpected events and the overwhelming nature of challenging situations when they actually arose. I remember applying this technique when facing one of the most difficult periods of my reign. Reports had reached me that several provinces were experiencing simultaneous crisis plague in the east, barbarian incursions in the north, political unrest in Egypt. My initial reaction was panic at the seemingly impossible task of addressing multiple emergencies with limited resources. But I had already imagined exactly this kind of scenario during my morning practices. Instead of being paralyzed by the scope of the challenges, I was able to immediately begin applying the responses I had mentally rehearsed. I had already considered how to prioritize competing demands, how to delegate authority effectively when I couldn't be everywhere at once, and how to maintain my own equilibrium when facing overwhelming responsibilities. The crisis was still difficult, but it wasn't surprising or mysterious. I had a framework for approaching it that I had developed through repeated mental preparation. Negative visualization proved especially valuable in protecting me from the entitled expectations that often corrupt those in positions of power. By regularly imagining the loss of my authority, wealth, and status, I remained grateful for these things while I had them, rather than taking them for granted. I would picture myself stripped of imperial power, living as a private citizen, facing the same challenges as any ordinary person. This exercise helped me appreciate my current circumstances, while also preparing me to maintain my dignity and principles, regardless of external changes. The practice also extended to personal relationships. I would sometimes imagine the death of people I loved, not as a morbid fascination, but as a way of avoiding the complacency that diminishes our appreciation for those closest to us. When I spent time with my wife, children, or trusted friends, I would remind myself that this interaction might be our last. This awareness made me more present, more patient, and more grateful for their company. But perhaps the most important application of negative visualization was in preparing for my own failures and mistakes. I would imagine making poor decisions, facing criticism from people I respected, or discovering that policies I believed in were causing unintended harm. By mentally rehearsing how to respond to such situations with humility and wisdom rather than defensiveness or blame, I was better equipped to handle the inevitable moments when my judgment proved flawed. This preparation proved invaluable when I did make significant errors. There was a military campaign where my strategic decisions led to unnecessary casualties among our troops. My initial impulse was to rationalize the decisions or blame others for providing poor information. But because I had practiced responding to exactly this kind of failure in my visualizations, I was able to acknowledge the mistake, learn from it, and adjust our approach without becoming paralyzed by guilt or defensive about my competence. Negative visualization also helped me understand that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulties, but about developing the capacity to remain virtuous regardless of circumstances. By imagining myself facing various challenges while maintaining my commitment to wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, I built confidence that my character could withstand whatever tests life might present. The key to this practice was maintaining the right balance. The goal wasn't to become pessimistic or to expect the worst in every situation. Rather, it was to develop what I thought of as practical optimism, hope for the best, combined with preparation for various alternatives. This approach allowed me to pursue ambitious goals and maintain positive relationships, while also being ready to adapt gracefully when circumstances didn't unfold as planned. Over time, negative visualization became less about specific scenarios and more about developing a general attitude of psychological flexibility. I learned to hold my plans, expectations, and attachments lightly, committed enough to work diligently toward my goals, but detached enough to change course when wisdom demanded it. As emperor, I encountered every variety of difficult person imaginable, senators who opposed my policies for personal gain, generals who prioritized their own glory over strategic wisdom, courtiers who spread malicious gossip, and advisors who told me what they thought I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to know. Learning to deal with such people without losing my own peace of mind or compromising my principles became one of the most practical applications of Stoic philosophy. My first instinct, like most people's, was to respond to difficult behavior with anger, frustration, or retaliation. When senators criticized my policies in bad faith, I wanted to use my authority to silence them. When courtiers spread rumors about my family, I wanted to punish them publicly. When advisors gave me poor counsel, I wanted to humiliate them for their incompetence. But I gradually learned that these reactive responses not only failed to solve the underlying problems, but often made them worse while damaging my own character in the process. The breakthrough came when I began to understand that difficult people are usually acting from their own pain, fear, or limitation rather than from deliberate malice. The senator who opposed every proposal I made wasn't necessarily my enemy. He might have been struggling with political pressures I didn't understand. The advisor who gave consistently poor counsel wasn't necessarily incompetent. He might have been operating with incomplete information or trying to tell me what he thought would please me rather than what would serve the empire. This shift in perspective didn't excuse their behavior or eliminate the problems it created, but it changed how I approached solutions. Instead of asking, how can I punish this person for frustrating me, I began asking what need or fear is driving this behavior, and how can I address the underlying issue. This approach proved far more effective at actually resolving conflicts and improving relationships. I developed what I called the practice of charitable interpretation, always assuming the most generous possible explanation for someone's actions, unless evidence clearly proved otherwise. When someone criticized my decisions, I would first consider whether they might have valid points I hadn't considered. When someone failed to carry out my instructions effectively, I would ask whether my communication had been clear and whether they had the resources necessary for success. When someone seemed to be working against my interests, I would explore whether we might actually share common goals but have different ideas about how to achieve them. This doesn't mean I became naive or failed to recognize genuine malice when it existed, but I discovered that most apparent hostility dissolves when you respond to it with curiosity rather than defensiveness. People who expected me to react with anger or retaliation were often disarmed by questions like, help me understand your perspective, or what would you recommend in this situation? These responses frequently transformed adversaries into collaborators. I also learned the importance of managing my own emotional state when dealing with difficult people. If I allowed their behavior to disturb my inner peace, I became less capable of responding wisely and more likely to escalate conflicts. I developed the practice of taking a mental step back before responding to challenging behavior, reminding myself that my goal was not to win arguments or prove my superiority, but to serve the empire and maintain my own virtue. One technique that proved especially valuable was remembering that difficult people often serve as teachers, even when they don't intend to. The senator who constantly challenged my policies forced me to defend them more rigorously, often revealing weaknesses I hadn't noticed. The advisor who gave poor counsel taught me to seek multiple perspectives before making important decisions. The courtier who spread gossip reminded me of the importance of maintaining my reputation through actions rather than trying to control what others said about me. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that how I treated difficult people reflected my character more than their behavior reflected theirs. When I responded to criticism with patience, to incompetence with guidance, to hostility with curiosity, I was strengthening virtues that served me in every aspect of life. When I reacted with anger, retaliation, or contempt, I was weakening my own character, regardless of whether such responses were justified by others' behavior. There were certainly situations where firm action was necessary. When someone's behavior genuinely threatened the welfare of the empire or the safety of others, compassionate understanding had to be balanced with appropriate consequences. But I found that even necessary discipline could be administered with respect for the person's humanity and genuine concern for their well-being, rather than from anger or desire for revenge. The ultimate goal became maintaining my own virtue while effectively addressing the practical problems that difficult people created. This meant responding to each situation based on what wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance demanded rather than what my immediate emotions suggested. Sometimes this meant patient dialogue, sometimes firm boundaries, sometimes creative problem-solving, and sometimes accepting that certain relationships couldn't be improved despite my best efforts. Over time, I noticed that as I became more skilled at dealing with difficult people, I encountered fewer of them. This wasn't because I had changed my circumstances, but because I had changed my responses. When you stop taking others' behavior personally, when you respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, when you treat everyone with basic dignity regardless of how they treat you, people often rise to meet the standard you set rather than continuing patterns of destructive behavior. No practice contributed more to my development as both a leader and a human being than the discipline I maintained every evening without exception, a thorough, honest examination of the day that had just passed, regardless of whether I was in the imperial palace, a military camp, or traveling between provinces. I would spend the final hour before sleep reviewing my actions, thoughts, and decisions with the same rigor I applied to reviewing military strategies or administrative policies. This wasn't merely casual reflection or random remembering. I had developed a systematic approach that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my behavior while also recognizing progress and learning opportunities. The evening review became my daily reckoning with reality, a time when all pretenses fell away, and I had to face exactly who I had been that day, rather than who I imagined myself to be or who I aspired to become. I would begin by asking myself several specific questions that cut through self-deception and rationalization. Did I act according to my principles today, or did I compromise them for convenience? When I made decisions, was I motivated by virtue or by ego? How did I respond to criticism, setbacks, and challenges with wisdom or with emotion? Did I treat others with the respect and dignity they deserved as fellow human beings? Where did I fall short of my own standards, and what can I learn from those failures? The most valuable part of this practice was examining moments when I had reacted poorly to situations. If I had become angry with an advisor, I would analyze what had triggered that anger and whether it was justified. Often, I discovered that my irritation had more to do with my own pride or expectations than with the advisor's actual behavior. If I had made a decision hastily without proper consultation, I would explore what had driven that haste and how I could avoid similar mistakes in the future. But the evening review wasn't an exercise in self-flagellation. I also made sure to acknowledge moments when I had acted wisely, shown compassion, or demonstrated virtue under pressure. This balanced approach helped me recognize patterns of growth while maintaining realistic standards for improvement. I learned to celebrate progress without becoming complacent and to acknowledge failures without becoming discouraged. One of the most challenging aspects of this practice was maintaining complete honesty with myself. As emperor, I was surrounded by people who rarely contradicted me or pointed out my mistakes. The evening review became my only reliable source of truthful feedback about my performance. This required developing the courage to see myself clearly, even when that vision was unflattering, and the humility to admit when I had been wrong. I discovered that regular self-examination had several unexpected benefits beyond simple self-awareness. First, it made me more conscious of my behavior during the day. Knowing that I would be reviewing my actions each evening made me more thoughtful about those actions as they occurred. I found myself pausing before reacting to situations, asking myself how I would evaluate this response during my evening reflection. Second, the practice helped me identify patterns in my behavior that I might otherwise have missed. I noticed that I tended to make poorer decisions when I was tired, that I was more likely to lose patience when dealing with certain types of problems, and that my judgment was often clouded by specific emotional triggers. Recognizing these patterns allowed me to develop strategies for managing them more effectively. The evening review also became a tool for continuous learning and improvement. By systematically analyzing what had worked well and what hadn't, I could refine my approaches to leadership, relationships, and personal discipline. Each day became an experiment from which I could extract lessons for future application. Perhaps most importantly, this practice helped me maintain perspective on both my successes and failures. When things went well, the evening review reminded me of the role that luck, timing, and others' efforts had played in those successes, preventing me from becoming arrogant or taking credit for outcomes beyond my control. When things went poorly, the review helped me separate temporary setbacks from permanent character flaws and identify specific steps I could take to improve. I also used the evening review to strengthen my gratitude practice. After examining my failures and learning opportunities, I would deliberately focus on what had gone well that day, relationships that had brought me joy, challenges that had helped me grow, opportunities to serve others that had given my life meaning. This shift from self-criticism to appreciation helped me end each day with a sense of fulfillment rather than regret. Over time, the evening review transformed from a discipline I imposed on myself to a practice I looked forward to. It became a time of clarity and peace, a daily opportunity to learn and grow, a regular reminder of what truly mattered in life. The insights I gained during these quiet reflections often proved more valuable than the advice of counselors or the information in official reports. The cumulative effect of years of honest self-examination was a deep self-knowledge that made me more effective as a leader and more content as a person. I understood my strengths and limitations, my patterns and triggers, my values and motivations. This self-awareness didn't eliminate my flaws, but it gave me the tools to manage them more skillfully and the wisdom to work with my nature rather than against it. The most transformative realization of my entire philosophical journey came when I moved beyond simply accepting difficult circumstances to actually loving them. This concept, which I called amor fati pres, Love of fate represented the pinnacle of Stoic practice and the ultimate expression of human freedom. Instead of merely enduring hardship or resignedly submitting to adversity, I learned to embrace every aspect of my experience as exactly what was needed for my growth and service. This shift didn't happen overnight. For years, I had practiced acceptance of things beyond my control, finding peace in acknowledging that fighting against unchangeable circumstances only added unnecessary suffering to inevitable challenges. But acceptance, while valuable, still contained a subtle resistance, a sense that while I wouldn't fight against my circumstances, I would prefer them to be different. Amor Fati went beyond this limited accommodation to genuine gratitude for whatever life presented. The breakthrough came during one of the darkest periods of my reign, when multiple crises seemed to converge simultaneously. The plague was devastating. Our city's Germanic tribes were pressing our northern borders. There were rumors of rebellion in eastern provinces, and several of my most trusted advisors had died or been forced to retire due to age and illness. My initial response was the familiar practice of acknowledging that these challenges were beyond my control and focusing on responding virtuously to them. But as I sat in my tent one evening, exhausted from another day of impossible decisions and tragic reports, I experienced a profound shift in perspective. Instead of seeing these circumstances as obstacles to overcome or burdens to bear, I began to understand them as precisely the experiences I needed to develop the qualities that would serve both my own growth and the empire's welfare. The plague was teaching me about impermanence and the preciousness of life. The military challenges were developing my strategic thinking and leadership skills. The political difficulties were forcing me to become more skillful in understanding human nature and building consensus. I realized that wishing for different circumstances was essentially wishing to be a different person, because we are shaped by what we experience and how we respond to it. The specific combination of challenges I faced was creating specific opportunities for virtue that wouldn't have existed under easier conditions. If I had been born into a peaceful time with no significant difficulties, I never would have developed the resilience, wisdom, and compassion that these very difficulties were teaching me. This understanding transformed my relationship with adversity, from resistance to partnership. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" I began asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" Instead of focusing on how to eliminate problems, I started exploring how to extract maximum growth and service from whatever situations presented themselves. This shift didn't make the challenges less real or less difficult, but it made them meaningful in a way that mere endurance could never achieve. Amor Fati also changed how I viewed my role as emperor. Instead of seeing the burden of leadership as something imposed upon me by circumstances beyond my control, I began to understand it as the perfect training ground for developing the qualities I most wanted to cultivate. The impossible decisions forced me to develop wisdom. The criticism and opposition taught me patience and humility. The responsibility for millions of lives deepened my sense of service and commitment to justice. Even the loneliness that came with ultimate authority became an opportunity to develop self-reliance and inner strength. But perhaps the most profound application of this principle was in how it transformed my relationship with personal loss and suffering. When people I loved died, when policies I believed in failed, when my own body began to show signs of aging and decline instead of viewing these as punishments or cosmic mistakes, I learned to see them as integral parts of a larger pattern that was somehow perfect in its design. Even when I couldn't understand that design from my limited perspective, this didn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Amor Fati never meant abandoning effort or failing to work toward improvement. Instead, it meant bringing passionate engagement to whatever circumstances existed while holding the outcomes lightly. I could work diligently to end the plague while simultaneously appreciating what the experience of leading during such a crisis was teaching me about leadership, compassion, and human resilience. The practice of amor fati required daily cultivation. Each morning, I would remind myself that whatever the day brought, whether pleasant or difficult, expected or surprising, was exactly what I needed for my continued development. Each evening, I would reflect on how the day's experiences had contributed to my growth. Even when that contribution wasn't immediately obvious, over time, this practice created a profound sense of trust in the fundamental rightness of existence. Not rightness in the sense that everything was pleasant or easy, but rightness in the sense that everything was meaningful and useful when approached with the proper attitude. This trust eliminated the underlying anxiety that had previously colored my experience. The constant worry that circumstances might become too difficult to handle, or that I might face challenges beyond my capacity to meet them virtuously. Amor fati became the foundation for what I consider the deepest possible peace, not the peace of having easy circumstances, but the peace of knowing that you can find meaning, growth, and opportunity for service in any circumstances, whatever. This is the ultimate freedom that philosophy offers. Liberation, not from difficulty, but from the suffering we add to difficulty through our resistance to it. When the weight of imperial responsibilities threatened to crush my spirit, when the endless stream of crises and decisions seemed overwhelming, I learned to practice what became one of my most powerful techniques for maintaining perspective: the view from above. This exercise involved mentally stepping outside my immediate circumstances and viewing my situation from an increasingly elevated perspective, until the problems that had seemed so urgent and overwhelming revealed their proper proportions. I would begin by imagining myself rising above the immediate scene, whether that was the throne room, where senators debated policy, the military camp, where I planned strategy, or the study, where I wrestled with complex administrative decisions. From this slightly elevated view, I could see my own concerns as part of a larger pattern of human activity. The argument that had consumed my attention for hours became one conversation among many happening simultaneously across the empire, but I wouldn't stop there. I would continue rising in my imagination, viewing first the entire city of Rome, then the Italian peninsula, then the full extent of the empire. From this height, the crisis that had dominated my thoughts became one small element in a vast tapestry of human experience. The border dispute that had kept me awake at night was a tiny fluctuation in boundaries that had shifted countless times throughout history and would continue, shifting long after my reign ended. Still, I would rise higher, imagining the view from the celestial sphere, seeing the entire Earth as a small planet among countless others in an infinite universe. From this cosmic perspective, the Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity in human history, appeared as a brief arrangement of human activity on a small world circling an ordinary star. The problems that had seemed so monumentally important were revealed as temporary perturbations in patterns that stretched across incomprehensible spans of time and space. This exercise wasn't meant to diminish the importance of my responsibilities or encourage indifference to human suffering. Rather, it was designed to provide proper context for my efforts and appropriate humility about my role in the larger scheme of existence. When viewed from the cosmic perspective, my failures weren't catastrophic disasters, but natural parts of the human learning process. My successes weren't proof of my greatness, but fortunate outcomes that depended on countless factors beyond my control. The view from above helped me understand that the universe operated according to rational principles that were far more comprehensive and wise than any human planning could achieve. The challenges I faced weren't cosmic mistakes or personal punishments, but natural expressions of the creative tension that drives all development and change. From this elevated perspective, I could see how apparent setbacks often led to unexpected Opportunities and how seeming victories sometimes contained the seeds of future difficulties. This practice proved especially valuable when dealing with political opposition and personal criticism. When senators attacked my policies or when former allies turned against me, my immediate reaction was often hurt pride or angry defensiveness. But when I viewed these conflicts from above, I could see them as natural expressions of human diversity, rather than personal affronts. People had different perspectives, different interests, different information. Of course, they would sometimes disagree with my decisions. This cosmic view helped me respond to opposition with curiosity and respect, rather than hostility and rigidity. The view from above also transformed my understanding of legacy and historical significance. From ground level, I was consumed with questions about how my reign would be remembered, what monuments would preserve my name, what policies would survive my death. But from the cosmic perspective, I could see that these concerns, while natural, were ultimately beside the point. What mattered wasn't whether future generations would remember Marcus Aurelius, but whether the principles I embodied and the service I provided contributed positively to the ongoing human experiment in civilization. I found that this practice created a profound sense of connection to something larger than myself, while simultaneously reducing the ego-driven anxieties that often plagued leadership decisions. When you regularly contemplate your place in the cosmic order, you develop what I came to think of as appropriate humility, not the false modesty that diminishes your capacity for action, but the accurate understanding of your true proportions. That allows you to act boldly without being attached to specific outcomes. The view from above also helped me maintain equanimity during both success and failure. When military campaigns succeeded or when popular policies increased my standing with the people, the cosmic perspective reminded me that these achievements were temporary and dependent on forces beyond my control. When plans failed or when circumstances developed in unexpected directions, the same perspective helped me see these setbacks as natural fluctuations rather than personal catastrophes. Perhaps most importantly, this practice cultivated what I can only describe as cosmic gratitude appreciation for the opportunity to participate consciously in the grand patterns of existence. From the elevated view, human life appeared not as a burden to be endured or a competition to be won, but as a miraculous opportunity to experience consciousness, to develop virtue, and to contribute to the ongoing story of rational beings learning to live together wisely. The most profound lesson I learned about leadership was that words, no matter how eloquent or well-reasoned, could never compete with the power of personal example. Every action I took, every decision I made, every response I gave to pressure or criticism was observed, analyzed, and ultimately imitated by those around me. This realization transformed my understanding of imperial authority from the power to command others to the responsibility to embody the qualities I wanted to see throughout the empire. In the early years of my reign, I focused heavily on crafting the right policies, delivering the right speeches, and issuing the right decrees. I believed that effective leadership meant having the correct answers and communicating them clearly to my subjects. But I gradually discovered that people were far more influenced by what they saw me do than by what they heard me say. A single act of integrity under pressure taught more about virtue than hours of philosophical discourse. A moment of composure during crisis inspired more confidence than elaborate proclamations about imperial strength. This insight forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I could not ask others to embrace standards that I was unwilling to maintain myself. If I wanted senators to prioritize the empire's welfare over their personal interests, I had to demonstrate that willingness consistently in my own choices. If I expected generals to show courage in difficult circumstances, I had to display that same courage when facing my own challenges. If I demanded honesty from my advisors, I had to model honesty even when it was inconvenient or politically costly. The weight of this responsibility was both burdensome and liberating. Burdensome because it meant I could never relax my vigilance about my own character, never allow myself the luxury of acting according to mood or convenience rather than principle. Every moment of my public life, and I came to understand that as emperor, all of my life was essentially public, was an opportunity either to strengthen or to undermine the very qualities I was trying to promote throughout Roman society. But it was also liberating because it simplified decision-making tremendously. Instead of calculating political advantages or trying to predict how various constituencies would respond to different choices, I could focus on a single question: what action would best exemplify the virtues I want to encourage in others? This clarity cut through the complexity of most situations and provided a reliable guide for behavior that served both my own character development and my duties as a leader. I learned that authentic leadership requires the courage to be vulnerable about your own struggles and limitations, rather than pretending to be perfect or trying to maintain an image of infallibility. I found that acknowledging my mistakes and demonstrating how to learn from them actually increased, rather than decreased, respect from those I led. When I publicly admitted errors in judgment, people saw not weakness, but humanity. When I showed how to respond constructively to criticism, they learned how to handle their own setbacks with dignity. One of the most powerful examples I could provide was how to remain calm and rational under extreme pressure. During the plague years, when reports of mounting deaths arrived daily and desperate citizens looked to me for solutions I didn't possess, my natural response was often panic or despair. But I realized that if I allowed these emotions to control my behavior, the resulting fear and confusion would spread throughout the administration and ultimately to the entire population. By maintaining visible composure and continuing to make thoughtful decisions despite the overwhelming circumstances, I helped preserve social stability during an impossibly difficult period. The principle of leading by example also transformed my approach to luxury and privilege. As emperor, I had access to unprecedented wealth, comfort, and indulgence, but I understood that my relationship with these advantages would profoundly influence how others viewed material success and personal discipline. If I lived extravagantly while asking citizens to make sacrifices for the common good, my words would ring hollow regardless of how noble they sounded. By maintaining relatively simple personal habits and using imperial resources primarily for public rather than private purposes, I could encourage similar priorities throughout society. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that leading by example created a positive feedback loop that strengthened my own character. Knowing that others were watching and learning from my behavior made me more conscious of that behavior and more committed to maintaining high standards. The responsibility to be a good example became a powerful motivation for personal growth that served my own development while simultaneously serving my leadership responsibilities. I also learned that people are remarkably perceptive about authenticity. Attempts to project qualities I didn't actually possess were quickly detected and ultimately counterproductive. The only sustainable approach was to genuinely develop the character traits I wanted to model rather than simply performing them for public consumption. This meant that becoming an effective leader required becoming a better person, and becoming a better person enhanced my effectiveness as a leader. The ultimate goal became creating what I thought of as a culture of virtue, environment where good character was not only expected, but actively encouraged through the daily example of those in positions of authority. When people consistently saw wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance demonstrated by their leaders, these qualities began to seem normal and achievable rather than exceptional and unrealistic. The power of example rippled outward from the imperial court to provincial administrators, from military commanders to local officials, gradually elevating the character of the entire system. No challenge tested my philosophical principles more severely than preparing for my own succession and confronting the painful reality that my son, Commodus, might not possess the character necessary for wise leadership. The question of succession forced me to grapple with the tension between my duties as a father, my responsibilities as emperor, and my commitment to the empire's welfare. It became a profound meditation on the limits of influence, the nature of legacy, and the courage required to face difficult truths about those we love most. From early in my reign, I had wrestled with the imperial succession system. Unlike the early emperors who had adopted mature, proven leaders as their heirs, I faced the challenge of having a biological son who would naturally be expected to inherit power. Roman tradition and political stability both suggested that passing authority to Commodus would be the smoothest transition. But my years of studying human nature and my daily observations of my son's development raised troubling questions about whether such a transition would serve the empire's best interests. Commodus possessed many admirable qualities. He was intelligent, charismatic, and genuinely popular with both the army and the people. But I increasingly noticed traits that concerned me deeply: an attraction to luxury over duty, a preference for spectacle over substance, and most troubling of all, a tendency to surround himself with flatterers rather than advisors who would challenge him to grow. I watched him make decisions based on immediate pleasure rather than long-term consequences, and I saw how he responded to criticism with defensive anger rather than thoughtful consideration. The philosophical framework I had developed over decades seemed insufficient to address this deeply personal dilemma. Stoic principles taught me to focus on what I could control and accept what I could not. But where exactly was the boundary between these categories when it came to my son's character development? How much influence could I reasonably expect to have over another person's fundamental nature, even when that person was my own child? And how should I balance my natural desire to believe in his potential for growth against my responsibility to protect millions of people from potentially destructive leadership? I spent countless hours trying to guide Commodus toward greater wisdom and virtue. I arranged for him to study with the finest philosophers and rhetoricians of our time. I gradually increased his administrative responsibilities, hoping that real accountability would develop his judgment and sense of duty. I modeled the kind of leadership I hoped he would emulate and tried to share the philosophical insights that had guided my own development. But I learned the painful truth that character cannot be imposed from the outside, no matter how much authority or influence you possess. This experience taught me about the ultimate loneliness of leadership and the limits of even parental love. As emperor, I could command legions, reshape laws, and influence the development of entire provinces. But I could not command my son to embrace wisdom, reshape his fundamental values, or influence his character beyond what he was willing to accept. The person closest to me was also, in some ways, the person over whom I had the least real control. The succession question also forced me to confront my own mortality and the temporary nature of all human achievement. The empire I had devoted my life to serving would continue long after my death, but it would be shaped by forces and decisions I could not anticipate or control. The policies I had implemented could be reversed. The philosophical principles I had tried to embed in Roman governance could be abandoned. The very reforms I considered most important could be dismantled by my successor. This realization was simultaneously humbling and liberating. I gradually came to understand that my primary responsibility was not to guarantee specific outcomes after my death, but to do everything possible to prepare both my son and the empire for whatever challenges they would face together. This meant continuing to model virtuous leadership regardless of whether Commodus seemed to be learning from that example. It meant strengthening institutional structures that could provide stability even if individual leadership proved inadequate. It meant surrounding my son with the wisest advisors I could find, even knowing that he might choose to ignore their counsel. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to distinguish between my hopes for my son and my duties as emperor. My love for Commodus made me want to believe he would become a great ruler, but my responsibility to the empire required me to prepare for the possibility that he might not. This led me to focus increasingly on developing systems and traditions that could survive changes in leadership rather than depending entirely on the character of individual emperors. The succession crisis taught me that true leadership sometimes means accepting limitations on your ability to control the future, while continuing to act responsibly within those limitations. I could not guarantee that my son would be a philosopher emperor, but I could ensure that he inherited an empire with strong institutions, wise advisors, and established precedents for virtuous governance. I could not force him to embrace philosophical principles, but I could demonstrate through my own example how those principles enhanced rather than constrained effective leadership. In the end, I realized that legacy is not primarily about what happens immediately after you die, but about the quality of service you provide while you live. My influence on the future would come not mainly through my son's subsequent choices, but through the example I set, the institutions I strengthened, the principles I embodied, and the culture of virtue I tried to cultivate throughout my reign. This understanding brought a kind of peace about the succession. Question not because I had resolved all my concerns about Commodus, but because I had clarified what was truly mine to control and what was not. As I write these words in my tent, along the Danube frontier, I know this will be my final military campaign. My body, which has served me faithfully through nearly 2 decades of imperial duties, is finally succumbing to the accumulated weight of years, stress, and the various ailments that have plagued me throughout this last expedition. But rather than filling me with despair or regret, this awareness of approaching death has brought a profound clarity about what philosophy is truly meant to accomplish. The irony is not lost on me that I should face my mortality here, in this rough military camp, surrounded by the sounds of soldiers preparing for battle rather than in the marble halls of the palace where emperors traditionally breathed their last. But perhaps this setting is more appropriate than any palace could be. It was here, in similar camps during previous campaigns, that I wrote many of my deepest philosophical reflections. It was here that the principles of Stoicism were tested most severely against the harsh realities of leadership under pressure. It seems fitting that here too I should face the ultimate test of those principles. I find myself remarkably calm about the prospect of death. This tranquility doesn't come from indifference to life. Have loved my existence, found deep meaning in my service, and treasured my relationships with family and friends. Rather, this peace emerges from years of philosophical preparation that have taught me to see death, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a natural completion of the cycle that began with birth. Every morning for decades, I have reminded myself that this day might be my last. Now that this theoretical possibility is becoming practical reality, I discover that the preparation was worthwhile. The physical symptoms that signal my body's decline, the persistent fever, the growing weakness, the increasing difficulty in maintaining the energy required for command serve as daily reminders of truths I have long contemplated in theory. The body is indeed temporary, subject to forces beyond our control, ultimately destined to return to the elements from which it came, but the principles I have lived by, the character I have developed, the service I have provided, these have a different kind of reality that cannot be diminished by physical dissolution. I think often now about what philosophy has meant to me throughout this journey from reluctant young emperor to dying old man. In my youth, philosophical study seemed like an intellectual luxury, a beautiful but impractical pursuit that had little relevance to the urgent demands of governing an empire. But experience taught me that philosophy is not abstract speculation. Divorced from practical life, it is the most practical discipline imaginable, providing tools for maintaining sanity, wisdom, and virtue under the most challenging circumstances possible. The Stoic principles that once seemed rigid and demanding have revealed themselves as sources of tremendous freedom. The discipline of focusing only on what I could control liberated me from the anxiety of trying to manage outcomes beyond my influence. The practice of viewing challenges as opportunities for virtue transformed obstacles from sources of frustration into occasions for growth. The cultivation of inner tranquility provided a stable foundation for effective action regardless of external chaos. As I face these final weeks or months, I find myself reviewing not my political achievements or military victories, but the moments when I successfully applied philosophical principles under pressure, the times when I responded to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, the occasions when I chose virtue over political expedience, the instances when I maintained composure during crises that could have justified panic or despair. These victories over my own limitations and reactions seem more significant now than any territorial conquests or legislative successes. I am also struck by how the approach of death clarifies what truly matters and what was merely distraction. The political intrigues that once consumed hours of my attention now seem like elaborate games with little lasting significance. The praise and criticism that once had the power to affect my mood for days now appear as passing winds that touch the surface but never reach the depth. What remains meaningful are the relationships based on genuine affection and mutual respect, the service provided to causes larger than personal ambition, and the gradual development of character that has made this life worth living. But I do not want to give the impression that this final period has been without struggle or that philosophy has eliminated all difficulty from dying. There are moments of sadness about leaving loved ones, regret about opportunities missed or mistakes made, and natural human reluctance to surrender the familiar patterns of embodied existence. What philosophy has provided is not the elimination of these feelings, but the framework for experiencing them without being overwhelmed by them. The most profound gift of philosophical preparation for death is the recognition that this ending is also a form of completion, just as a musical composition requires its final notes to achieve wholeness, and just as a narrative needs its conclusion to create meaning. A human life finds its full significance partly through its ending. Death is not an interruption of life, but its natural culmination, the final expression of the mortality that gives urgency and poignancy to every choice we make. From this perspective, my approaching death becomes not a defeat, but a graduation, not a punishment, but a promotion to whatever comes next, whether that is consciousness in some other form or simply the peaceful dissolution of awareness back into the cosmic processes from which it emerged. I can face it with gratitude for the opportunity to have participated consciously in the grand experiment of existence. As I near the end of my time, I want to share with you how the philosophical principles that sustained me through the unique challenges of imperial leadership can serve you in facing the very different but equally real challenges of your own era. The circumstances of human life change dramatically across centuries, but the fundamental patterns of struggle, growth, and the search for meaning remain remarkably constant. The Stoic practices that helped me govern an empire can help you govern your own life with greater wisdom and tranquility. Begin each day, as I did, with a few moments of deliberate preparation for whatever challenges you might encounter. Before checking messages, before engaging with the demands that others place upon you, spend time remembering what you can and cannot control. You cannot control other people's behavior, unexpected setbacks, or the countless external events that will shape your day. But you can control your responses, your effort, your attitude, and your commitment to virtue. This simple distinction, when applied consistently, will transform your relationship with stress and uncertainty. Develop the practice of negative visualization by regularly imagining the loss of things you currently take for granted. Spend a few minutes each week contemplating what your life would be like if you lost your job, your health, important relationships, or material possessions. This isn't morbid thinking, it's practical preparation that will help you appreciate what you have while building resilience for inevitable changes. When you've mentally rehearsed how to respond virtuously to various setbacks, you'll be less shocked and more capable when they actually occur. Create your own version of the evening review by spending time each night honestly examining how you responded to the day's challenges. Ask yourself, where did I act according to my values, and where did I compromise them? How did I handle criticism, setbacks, and frustrations? What triggered my worst responses, and how can I prepare differently for similar situations? This practice of systematic self-examination will accelerate your personal growth and help you recognize patterns that might otherwise remain invisible when dealing with difficult people, whether colleagues, family members, or strangers. Practice charitable interpretation by assuming the most generous possible explanation for their behavior unless evidence clearly proves otherwise. Instead of immediately attributing malicious motives to actions that frustrate you, consider what pain, fear, or limitation might be driving their behavior. This shift in perspective often transforms potential conflicts into opportunities for understanding and connection. Learn to distinguish between your immediate emotional reactions and your considered responses. You cannot control the feelings that arise when you face criticism, disappointment, or injustice, but you can control what you do with those feelings. Practice creating a brief pause between stimulus and responsive, and a few deep breaths can provide enough space for wisdom to override impulse. This small habit will prevent countless regrettable words and actions while building your reputation for thoughtfulness and composure. Apply the view from above whenever you feel overwhelmed by immediate circumstances. Step back mentally and imagine how your current crisis will appear in a year, a decade, or a century. Consider how an outside observer might view your situation, what advice you would give to someone else facing identical challenges, or how this particular difficulty fits into the larger pattern of your life's development. This elevated perspective usually reveals that problems you thought were catastrophic are actually manageable and temporary. Embrace obstacles as training rather than punishment. When you encounter setbacks, opposition, or unexpected difficulties, ask yourself what virtues these circumstances are helping you develop. Patience, resilience, creativity, humility, perseverance. Every challenge strengthens some quality that will serve you throughout your life. This reframing transforms you from a victim of circumstances into a willing participant in your own development. Practice memento mori by regularly remembering that your time is limited and uncertain. This isn't meant to create anxiety, but to provide urgency and clarity about what truly matters. When you remember that both you and everyone you interact with will eventually die, you become less likely to waste time on petty concerns and more likely to focus on what will have lasting significance. This awareness makes every day more precious and every relationship more meaningful. Develop a personal mission statement based on virtue rather than external outcomes. Instead of defining success solely through achievements, recognition, or material acquisition, focus on becoming the kind of person you most admire. Ask yourself what wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance look like in your specific circumstances. Then organize your daily choices around developing these qualities, regardless of how others respond. Create supportive routines that strengthen your philosophical practice. Just as physical fitness requires regular exercise, character development requires consistent attention. This might include daily reading of philosophical texts, weekly reflection on your progress and challenges, monthly evaluation of your priorities and goals, or annual assessment of your growth and direction. The specific practices matter less than their consistency and relevance to your particular needs and circumstances. Finally, remember that philosophy is not about perfection, but about progress. I made countless mistakes during my reign, responded poorly to numerous situations, and fell short of my own ideals more times than I care to remember. But each failure became an opportunity to learn, adjust, and improve. The goal is not to eliminate all struggles, but to struggle more wisely. Not to avoid all suffering, but to find meaning in whatever suffering cannot be avoided. The principles that guided me through the complexities of governing an empire, focusing on what you can control, practicing virtue regardless of outcomes, maintaining perspective during difficulties, treating others with dignity and respect, learning from setbacks rather than being defeated by them. These same principles can guide you through whatever challenges and opportunities your own life presents. The external circumstances may be vastly different, but the internal work of developing character and wisdom remains the same. As I prepare to lay down this burden of empire and return to the universal substance from which we all emerge and to which we all return, I want to leave you with the most important insights from a life spent trying to live according to philosophical principles while bearing the weight of extraordinary responsibility. These words may be among my last, but I hope they will serve you long after my voice has fallen silent. The greatest discovery of my life was not found in any conquered territory or diplomatic achievement, but in the simple recognition that happiness, peace, and fulfillment are not dependent on external circumstances, but on the quality of our responses to whatever circumstances we encounter. You have within you, right now, everything necessary for a meaningful and virtuous life. The power to choose your attitude, to define your values, to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. These capabilities are your birthright as a rational being, and no external force can take them away unless you surrender them yourself. I have ruled the most powerful empire in human history, commanded vast armies, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. But I want you to understand that the most important battles I fought were not against Germanic tribes or Parthian armies, but against my own tendencies toward anger, pride, despair, and self-pity. The victories that brought me the greatest satisfaction were not military conquests, but moments when I successfully chose virtue over convenience, wisdom over impulse, service over self. These internal victories are available to every person regardless of their external circumstances or social position. Remember that you are both infinitely small and infinitely significant. Small because you are one brief consciousness in a vast universe that has existed for eons before you and will continue for eons after you. This perspective should protect you from the arrogance that comes from taking yourself too seriously or believing that your particular concerns are of cosmic importance. But you are also infinitely significant because you have the miraculous capacity for reason, virtue, and conscious choice. You can participate knowingly in the great human project of learning to live together, wisely and compassionately. Do not wait for perfect circumstances to begin living according to your highest principles. I spent my early years believing that I would apply philosophical insights once I had more time, more experience, or easier conditions. But I learned that challenges are not obstacles to virtue. They are the very occasions that make virtue necessary and meaningful. The person who waits for ideal conditions to practice courage will never be brave. The person who postpones justice until it becomes convenient will never be just. Begin today, with whatever difficulties you face, to respond as the best version of yourself would respond. Understand that your influence extends far beyond your awareness or intention. Every action you take, every word you speak, every choice you make creates ripples that affect other people in ways you will never fully comprehend. This is both a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous opportunity. By consistently choosing virtue, you become part of the solution to humanity's ancient problems. By modeling wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance in your daily life, you inspire others to develop these same qualities, even if you never know about their development. Accept that you will make mistakes, face setbacks, and sometimes fall short of your own ideals. Perfection is not the goal, progress is. What matters is not whether you never fail, but whether you learn from your failures and use them to become wiser and more compassionate. The person who has never struggled with adversity has never had the opportunity to develop real strength. The person who has never faced moral temptation has never had the chance to develop real character. Cultivate gratitude for the simple fact of your existence. You have been given the extraordinary gift of consciousness during a brief period when the universe is arranged in such a way that rational, loving beings can exist and communicate with one another. This is not something you earned or deserve, it is pure grace. The appropriate response to such a gift is not to demand more, but to use it well. Find joy in small moments, meaning in daily tasks, and purpose in serving causes larger than your immediate interests. Remember that death is not your enemy, but your teacher. The awareness that your time is limited should not create anxiety, but urgency to love generously, to serve wholeheartedly, to learn continuously, and to grow constantly. Every day is an opportunity that will never come again. Every relationship is a treasure that time will eventually reclaim. Every moment of consciousness is a miracle that deserves your full attention and appreciation. Finally, know that the principles I have shared with you are not merely ancient wisdom, but living truths that can transform your experience regardless of when or where you apply them. The Stoic path is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. It offers not escape from the human condition, but fulfillment within it. It promises not a life without difficulty, but a life where difficulties become opportunities for growth and service. As I prepare to join the generations of those who have gone before, I am filled not with regret for what I am leaving behind, but with gratitude for what I have been privileged to experience and contribute. I hope that something of what I have learned will live on in your choices, your character, and your commitment to making this brief existence meaningful for yourself and beneficial for others. The emperor dies, but the philosopher lives on in everyone who chooses wisdom over ignorance, virtue over vice, love over fear. Carry forward what serves you, and let the rest return to the silence from which it came. The universe is vast, your time is brief, your potential is unlimited. Use it well.